Hey guys, tonight you're stepping into a medieval wedding, where one wrong insult could start a bloody family feud, where drunken guests carried knives to the feast, and where even the church ceremony itself could collapse into scandal, theft, or chaos before dawn. You might imagine candles, music, and romance, but the reality was cold stone halls, dangerous roads, suspicious relatives, and enough ale to turn a wedding into a disaster by midnight. Honestly, medieval travel guides really left out the part about surviving the guests. So before we step through the castle gates, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these long medieval journeys with me. Now, lower the lights, get comfortable, and let's wander back into the dangerous world of medieval weddings together. Hey guys! Tonight you find yourself standing beneath the dripping gatehouse of a walled medieval town just as the last grey light of evening slips behind the hills. Rainwater trickles down the stone beside you in thin silver lines. Horses stamp impatiently in the mud. And somewhere overhead a watchman coughs like a man who has spent most of his life breathing smoke and winter air. The smell here is a heavy mixture of wet wool, wood smoke, horse sweat, and the sharp sourness of ale spilled into old straw. Bells ring faintly from a distant monastery beyond the river mist, marking the hour with slow authority, as if time itself belongs to the monks. You clutch your cloak tighter against the damp cold and glance at the crowded road ahead, where wedding guests push carts through ruts deep enough to swallow a boot. Medieval travel brochures really oversold this experience. You probably would not last a week out here without complaining about the smoke alone, never mind the fleas. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, feel free to comment your location and local time. Somewhere out there, another listener is probably hearing this beside rain on their own window. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The town gate creaks open with all the grace of an elderly ox lowering itself into mud, and you step beneath the archway among traders, pilgrims, and wedding guests wrapped in fur-lined cloaks darkened by rain. Torches hiss against the wet wind. The guards barely glance at you. Tonight, nearly everyone entering the town has business with the wedding feast being held inside the manor hall. And weddings in the medieval world are rarely simple things. You pass beneath chains hanging from the gate ceiling where iron lanterns sway gently in the draught. Someone nearby mutters a prayer to St. Julian, patron of travellers, while an old woman presses a sprig of rosemary into the hand of a nervous young bridemaid. Some swear rosemary keeps envy away during weddings. Others insist it only helps cover the smell of unwashed guests. Even now, it is hard to tell whether medieval customs survive because people believe in them or because no one wishes to risk abandoning them. The narrow streets inside the walls twist like damp ribbons between timber houses. Water drips steadily from thatched roofs. Rushes lie scattered across stone thresholds to soak up mud and spilled ale, though they mostly seem to succeed in becoming muddy themselves. A dog with one torn ear trots after you for several moments before stopping beside a butcher's stall, hopeful for scraps. Ahead, the wedding banners hang from the manor keep above the town square. Red cloth snaps in the wind. Lantern light glows behind narrow windows. Music already drifts faintly through the rain pipes. A drum, and the uneven singing of people who have started drinking long before sunset. You follow the crowd toward the square, boots sucking at the mud with every step. Beside the well, merchants still linger despite the weather, hoping wedding guests might spend a few extra coins before the feast begins. One sells tiny pewter pilgrim badges shaped like saints' hands. Another offers charms made from wolf teeth and bits of coloured thread. A bent old peddler catches your sleeve gently. "For safe marriage journeys," he whispers, holding up a small charm made from rowan wood. You ask whether it truly works. He shrugs beneath his hood. "Depends whether the spirits are listening tonight. That seems to be the general medical and spiritual policy of the Middle Ages." Further along, two boys carry baskets of coarse bread toward the manor kitchens while complaining bitterly about the cold. Smoke billows from vents high above the hall roof. Somewhere inside, cooks stir vast pots of pottage thick with onions and barley while servants haul smoked fish, trenchers, and ale casks across slippery courtyards. The closer you draw to the keep, the more guarded the atmosphere becomes beneath the celebration. Men wearing the groom's colours stand near the gatehouse, with hands resting close to their knives. Not openly threatening, just cautious in the way medieval people often are when large families gather together with alcohol involved. You overhear fragments as you pass, still angry about the land dispute, should never have promised 3 silver marks. The bride's uncle nearly struck someone at Candlemas. Weddings here are not merely celebrations. They're contracts stitched together with pride, property, and old resentment. A marriage can unite families. It can also reopen arguments buried for years beneath church sermons and polite smiles. Inside the outer courtyard, the rain finally begins to ease. Water drips from oak beams overhead. Stable boys rub down exhausted horses beneath hanging lanterns, while steam rises from the animals' flanks into the freezing air. You warm your hands briefly beside a brazier where 2 servants gossip quietly. The bride cried during supper. One says, "She should." The other replies, "Half the town says the groom's brothers cheat at dice." No one can quite agree whether this is considered a moral failing or merely a personality trait. A monastery bell sounds again somewhere beyond the walls, deep, slow, comforting in its own stern way. The sound rolls through the wet night air while servants cross the courtyard carrying beeswax candles protected beneath cloaks. You notice that many guests touch charms or small relics before entering the hall. One man kisses a tiny silver cross, another taps the doorway 3 times with his knuckles. A woman murmurs against an amber bead tied around her wrist. Medieval weddings carry strange invisible dangers in people's minds: envy, curses, evil eyes, bad luck, spirits angered by joy. Some believe a bride should never look directly into still water before the ceremony, or sorrow will follow her into marriage. Others insist that sleeping dogs near the wedding fire are signs of prosperity. The torn-ear dog from the market has somehow followed you all the way here and now curls beside the kitchen door. Perhaps prosperity has arrived after all. The manor hall itself rises before you at last. Tall and broad beneath the rain-dark sky, light flickers through narrow windows, smoke drifts from the roof vents. The heavy oak doors stand partly open, revealing warmth inside and noise. So much noise. Laughter rolls outward in waves, cups slam against tables, musicians scrape at fiddles while servants hurry through crowded aisles carrying steaming bowls. The smell reaches you: first roasted onions, damp wool drying near hearth fires, strong ale, and beeswax candles melting slowly beside soot-black rafters. You pause near the doorway as guests continue arriving around you, and for a moment you feel it clearly beneath the warmth and celebration, the tension like ice beneath river water. The bride's family gathers at one side of the hall, the groom's kin cluster opposite. Smiles appear, disappear, then return again. A knight near the hearth keeps glancing toward the entrance as though expecting trouble to ride through the gate at any moment. Because sometimes it does. In this world, A wedding feast can end in alliance, scandal, theft, bloodshed, legal disaster, or all four before dawn. Roads remain dangerous. Rival families remember insults forever. Drunken guests carry knives. Dowries vanish. Horses are stolen. Priests disagree over vows. Winter sickness spreads through crowded halls. And tonight, as rain taps softly against the shutters and the monastery bells fade into darkness beyond the walls, you step fully inside the manor hall and join the gathering storm disguised as celebration. The warmth of the manor hall settles around you slowly, more like damp wool than true comfort. Smoke curls lazily beneath the rafters, trapped there among blackened beams where generations of soot cling like old memories. Candles sputter along the trestle tables, their beeswax scent mixing with roasted onions, spilled ale, wet cloaks, and the faint medicinal smell of herbs hanging near the hearth. Rushes cover the stone floor in uneven patches, already flattened by muddy boots and dripping hems. You edge farther into the crowded hall while servants squeeze past carrying trenchers piled with coarse bread and smoked eel. Someone nearly elbows you into a table while reaching for a jug of ale. Medieval hospitality has its limits, especially after the third cup. At the far end of the hall sits the lord of the manor beneath a faded tapestry showing a hunting scene, where the dogs seem more disciplined than half the guests present tonight. Beside him gather the important families involved in the marriage arrangement. The bride's father wears a fur-lined cloak trimmed with squirrel pelts darkened by age. The groom's elder brother keeps one hand resting possessively atop a leather satchel that almost certainly contains contracts, tally sticks, or silver. Because before a medieval wedding becomes a holy union, it must survive becoming a business agreement. You settle near one of the side tables where lesser guests warm their hands around cups of ale, thick enough to count as stew. Nearby, two scribes sit hunched over parchments, their fingers stained black with ink. They work beside a candle protected behind horn panels while arguing softly over names, witness lists, and promised payments. One scratches irritably at the parchment. She said 4 geese. It was 3 geese and winter grain. No, that was the widow from Dunmere. The other sighs deeply. The exhausted sigh of a man who knows history may someday depend on handwriting produced in a freezing hall while half the room shouts over bagpipes. You glance toward the centre of the gathering where the bride herself finally appears through a side doorway surrounded by women carrying lanterns. A hush spreads unevenly through the hall. Not silence exactly, more like the room briefly remembering it is supposed to behave. She wears dark blue wool embroidered carefully at the sleeves, though rain has dampened the hem of her gown. A thin circlet rests over braided hair hidden partly beneath linen. Around her neck hangs a tiny reliquary cross. Some swear relics protect brides from jealousy and barrenness. Others quietly suspect they mostly protect churches from financial hardship by encouraging endless purchases of saint fragments. No one says this too loudly near monks. The bride keeps her eyes lowered as custom demands, though now and then you catch her glancing nervously toward the groom's table. The groom himself stands to greet her, broad-shouldered and solemn beneath a heavy cloak fastened with silver pins. He looks less like a romantic husband and more like a man about to negotiate timber rights, which, in fairness, is not entirely inaccurate. The families gather closer together near the hearth while servants refill cups. The musicians soften their playing. Everyone understands that important matters are beginning. A steward unrolls a parchment. The negotiations resume. You had perhaps imagined medieval weddings as simpler affairs, a few vows, some dancing, maybe a chicken turning slowly over the fire. Instead, you discover a process closer to armed diplomacy conducted beside turnips. The bride's dowry must be confirmed silver coins, winter wheat rights, 2 dairy cows, dyed wool cloth, and partial claim to a riverside meadow. In return, the groom's family promises protection, land inheritance, and favourable tenancy agreements for several relatives. Every detail matters. One wrong phrase can insult an entire bloodline. A servant quietly places bowls of pottage before the negotiators as though hot cabbage might prevent violence. Optimistic. Really. You notice that no one fully relaxes while the bargaining continues. Smiles appear carefully, then disappear again. One uncle keeps rubbing the pommel of his knife whenever land boundaries are mentioned. Another man drinks too quickly and mutters complaints into his beard. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether weddings caused old grudges or merely uncovered the ones already waiting beneath the surface. Outside, wind rattles the shutters. The tornado dog curls beneath a bench near the fire, ignored by everyone except a little girl feeding it scraps of trencher bread. The steward continues reading aloud, 3 acres bordering the eastern stream, rights to collect milling tolls during autumn fairs, safe conduct for merchants under the family seal. At last, the bride's father interrupts sharply. The orchard remains ours. Silence settles heavily across the table. Even the musicians falter. The groom's elder brother leans forward slowly. That was not the earlier understanding. It is now. You feel the temperature in the room change despite the roaring hearth nearby. Medieval people often lived close to danger in ways easy to forget harsh winters. Sickness, raids, poor harvests and land mean survival. An orchard is not merely pretty trees. It is cider, food stores, income, security. A monk standing nearby quietly fingers his rosary beads. The groom finally speaks, calm but careful. The orchard can remain under shared use. The tension loosens slightly. Cups rise again. Someone exhales loudly through their nose. Diplomacy survives another moment. You sip your ale while watching servants replenish candles around the hall. Wax drips slowly down iron holders onto tables scarred by years of knife marks and spilled stew. Above the hearth hangs a bundle of dried herbs, rosemary, sage, juniper. Some are meant for cooking, some for warding illness, some perhaps simply because medieval people trusted any plant that smelled strong enough. Beside you, an old woman quietly explains to a younger guest that marriages begun during heavy rain often produce stubborn children. Why, the girl asks. The woman shrugs. Rain remembers things. This explanation satisfies absolutely no one, and yet somehow ends the conversation entirely. Near the entrance, travellers arriving late stamp mud from their boots, while a servant collects small market tolls demanded by the manor lord. Even during weddings, someone is always counting coins. A pair of pilgrims wearing badges shaped like scallop shells kneel briefly near the wall to pray before accepting bowls of pottage. One of them whispers that bandits were seen on the North Road 3 nights earlier. Another guest mutters that the bride's cousin once vanished travelling that same forest route. Some swear he joined mercenaries, others insist the woods took him. Even now, it is hard to tell whether medieval forests are truly dangerous places or simply places where frightened people carry too many stories. The negotiations continue long into the evening. Wax shortens, ale disappears. Tempers rise and settle again like restless birds. Finally, the steward folds the parchment. Agreement. A murmur spreads across the hall, followed by cautious relief. Not joy exactly. Relief first. Joy may come later if no one ruins the feast. The musicians strike louder notes again. Servants hurry to bring fresh dishes from the kitchens. The Lord raises his cup. Guests answer with cheers that echo beneath the rafters. Yet even as celebration swells once more around the hall, you notice the bride staring briefly toward the shuttered windows where rainwater slides down the glass-dark night outside. Her expression is unreadable, tired perhaps, or uncertain, because in this world, once bargains are sealed and witnesses nod their approval, the true dangers of the wedding are only beginning. The hall grows louder after the agreements are sealed, though the relief inside the noise feels fragile, like warmth from a candle too near an open door. Servants move quickly between tables carrying fresh jugs of ale, while musicians settle into steadier tunes near the hearth. Rain still taps softly against the shutters, and smoke hangs thick beneath the rafters, despite every effort to push it upward through the roof vents. You remain near the side tables where the lesser guests gather, watching the strange transformation that overtakes the hall once bargaining gives way to ritual. Faces loosen, shoulders lower. Even the stern steward allows himself a swallow of warmed wine. Yet beneath the celebration, another mood begins to emerge: preparation. Because tomorrow the marriage vows will be spoken before the church altar, and tonight the families must guard the couple carefully against every possible misfortune medieval minds can imagine, which is quite a long list. The bride disappears briefly into a smaller chamber off the main hall, while women of both households follow carrying candles, herbs, folded cloth, and little leather pouches tied with a red thread. You drift closer out of curiosity and catch glimpses through the half-open doorway. One elderly aunt burns juniper branches in a shallow iron bowl, letting smoke curl around the bride's sleeves. Another ties tiny sprigs of rosemary into the linen beneath her veil. A third mutters prayers while placing salt inside the bride's shoes. No one can quite agree whether the salt keeps away evil spirits, bad fortune, infertility, or simply damp feet. Medieval customs often operate on the principle that if something has been done for 200 years, no sensible person wishes to be the first to stop. The bride sits patiently on a carved oak chest while women circle her like careful birds tending a nervous animal before winter travel. Her hands remain folded tightly in her lap. You notice how young she looks in the candlelight, younger than the weight of the evening. Outside the chamber, two servant girls whisper excitedly. They say the groom's mother buried iron nails beneath the threshold, for protection, for luck. I heard iron frightens spirits. I heard it frightens everyone. That, at least, seems historically reliable. The Tourneur dog wanders past again, carrying half a sausage in its mouth like a victorious knight returning from battle. No one stops it. Tonight even the servants seem too busy to challenge fate in canine form. Further along the hall, preparations continue with equal seriousness among the groom's family. A priest in dark wool robes blesses a silver marriage cup, while a young monk carefully copies names into a parish register using a goose-feather quill. Ink stains his fingertips so thoroughly they appear bruised. The monk yawns. You suspect saints may forgive sleepy handwriting after midnight. Near the hearth, several older women discuss omens in low voices while sorting candles. A draught during the vows means wandering children. A dropped candle means sorrow. A raven near the church roof means... At this point another woman interrupts firmly. Ravens are everywhere. If we feared every bird in England, no one would ever marry. A reasonable argument, though not persuasive enough to end the discussion. You settle onto a bench beside a pair of travelling merchants warming themselves near the fire. Their cloaks steam faintly as they dry. One gnaws on coarse bread while explaining that wedding gatherings attract thieves almost as reliably as fairs do. Too many distracted people, he says. Too much silver displayed openly. The other nods. And too much ale. This receives broad agreement from nearly everyone nearby. Weddings create ideal conditions for trouble. Guests arrive carrying gifts, coins, horses, jewellery, and family grudges. Doors remain open late into the night. Servants move constantly between rooms. Outsiders enter freely among crowds. By morning, half the hall may accuse the other half of stealing spoons. A servant suddenly hurries across the room carrying a bundle of white cloths. Behind her walks the bride once more. This time the hall quiets more completely. A ritual is beginning. You follow the guests gathering near the central hearth, where rushes crackle softly beneath boots. Candles flicker against damp stone walls while smoke drifts upward in blue-grey ribbons. The priest raises his hands, and everyone bows their heads, some reverently, some merely because everyone else is doing it. The bride steps forward carrying a beeswax candle wrapped with rosemary. The groom carries another. Together they circle the hearth 3 times. Some swear this old custom protects the marriage from winter hardship. Others say it honours ancient household spirits older than the church itself. Even now, it is hard to tell where medieval Christianity ends and older fears continue quietly wearing new clothing. The priest pretends not to notice this confusion, likely a survival skill. As the couple circles the fire, guests toss small herbs into the flames. Thyme, sage, lavender. The smoke sweetens slightly. Someone murmurs blessings for fertility. Another whispers against sickness. One old man quietly spits over a shoulder afterward to confuse malicious spirits. The man beside him immediately copies the gesture just to be safe. You begin to understand how medieval life becomes crowded with rituals not because people are foolish, but because the world feels uncertain in ways difficult to imagine now. Crops fail. Illness arrives suddenly. Winter kills livestock. Roads swallow travellers. Children vanish into fevers overnight. So if circling a fire with herbs and candles might improve one's chances against chaos, why risk refusing? Outside, wind whistles faintly through the shutters while monastery bells sound somewhere beyond the river again. The slow tolling drifts across the wet darkness, like a reminder that dawn continues approaching whether anyone feels prepared or not. A servant refills your cup with warm-spiced ale. Nearby, musicians begin softer tunes while guests settle onto benches. The hall grows calmer for a little while. People eat smoked fish from trenchers and tear coarse bread apart with cold fingers. Someone passes roasted chestnuts wrapped in cloth. The smell of damp wool slowly fades beneath wood smoke and herbs. At the far end of the room, the bride's younger brother argues quietly with one of the groom's cousins about sleeping arrangements. You took the west loft already. We arrived first. There are 6 men already snoring in there. Then it will sound no different with 7. Medieval hospitality remains a deeply flexible concept. You glance toward the windows again. Rain has stopped now. Beyond the glass-dark panes, torchlight flickers across the courtyard where stable boys continue working beneath the cold night sky. Horses stamp and snort softly into clouds of steam. Then suddenly one of the women near the hearth gasps. A candle has gone out. Conversation falters instantly. Several guests cross themselves. Others mutter prayers. One servant quickly relights the wick from another flame while trying not to appear alarmed. Draught from the shutters. Someone insists, but the room no longer sounds fully convinced. Because no matter how ordinary the cause may be, weddings in this world sit balanced delicately between celebration and fear. Every flickering shadow feels meaningful. Every accident threatens to become an omen. And as the candle flame finally steadies once more beneath the smoky rafters, you sense the entire hall listening carefully to the darkness beyond the walls, hoping nothing else follows the wind inside tonight. Morning arrives slowly beneath a blanket of grey cloud and lingering mist. You wake on a narrow bench near the manor wall with one leg entirely numb and the smell of damp rushes pressed into your cloak. Around you, the hall groans back to life in stages, servants stirring embers, guests coughing themselves awake, someone muttering prayers before searching desperately for misplaced boots. The torn-ear dog sleeps more comfortably than anyone else in the building. A pale draught slips through cracks in the shutters while monastery bells ring beyond the river, deep and measured in the dawn. The sound rolls through the town like slow breathing. Somewhere nearby, a rooster attempts enthusiasm but gives up halfway through the effort. You rub warmth back into your hands beside the hearth where cooks already stir pots of oat pottage for the morning meal. Steam rises thickly into the smoky rafters. A servant ladles ale into cups because medieval breakfast remained determined to begin exactly where medieval evenings ended. Outside the hall, the courtyard glistens with rainwater. Stable boys lead horses through puddles while wedding guests gather beneath cloaks and hoods. Today the bridal procession must cross the town toward the parish church beyond the market square. And despite the bells, the candles, the blessings, and half the herb supply of northern Europe burned into last night's fire, everyone still behaves as though danger might leap from behind a cart at any moment. You step into the cold morning air with the others. Your boots sink immediately into mud deep enough to qualify as local geography. Torches sputter along the courtyard walls though dawn has technically arrived. The sky simply refuses to commit. Servants bustle around the bride near the gatehouse, adjusting her cloak and veil while muttering anxious instructions. Do not stumble. Keep your gloves dry. Do not look backward once the bells begin. No one can quite agree whether looking backward invites bad luck, wandering spirits, infertility, or difficult mothers-in-law. Medieval superstition rarely limits itself to a single category. The bride says little. Her breath drifts pale in the freezing air while one young cousin carries the train of her gown carefully above the mud. Another clutches a small basket filled with rosemary and winter flowers. Nearby, the groom's brothers supervise the loading of gifts onto wagons' wool blankets, small casks of ale, smoked fish wrapped in cloth, carved chests, sacks of barley, candles, and a silver cup packed so carefully one might think it contains holy relics. Perhaps it effectively does. A wedding gift valuable enough to survive 3 generations becomes something close to sacred. At last the procession begins moving through the outer gate. First come the musicians with pipes and a small drum. Then servants carrying lanterns despite the daylight gloom. Then the bride and her household. Behind them follow merchants, cousins, pilgrims, retainers, and enough distant relatives to populate a medium-sized monastery. You join the slow-moving crowd as it winds through the muddy streets toward the church. Town life awakens around you. Bakers lift shutters from shop windows. A blacksmith's hammer begins ringing faintly somewhere near the eastern wall. Women sweep yesterday's refuse into gutters already swollen with rainwater. Children chase one another between carts until shouted at by nearly everyone. From upper windows, townsfolk lean outward to watch the procession pass below. Some toss herbs. Some make the sign of the cross. One old woman throws oats into the road ahead of the bride for fertility, accidentally striking a passing goat instead. The goat appears deeply offended by the blessing. You move slowly beside a group of villagers discussing recent rumours. North Road still unsafe. heard raiders cross the river last month. Someone robbed near the Abbey Forest. Even weddings travel under the shadow of danger here. Roads remain uncertain places where merchants vanish, carts overturn, horses break legs, and strangers disappear into woodland without explanation. Large wedding gatherings attract notice precisely because they carry wealth openly through public streets. 2 armed retainers walk near the wagons with spears upright against the grey sky. Not ceremonial, practical. As the procession enters the market square, bells begin ringing from the church tower ahead. Their sound echoes between timber buildings and wet stone walls, while pigeons burst upward into the morning mist. The church rises beyond the square, squat and ancient, its weathered stones darkened by centuries of rain. Moss creeps along the lower walls. Narrow stained glass windows glow faintly where candlelight burns inside. A graveyard surrounds the building, uneven with leaning markers and damp grass silvered by moisture. You notice several guests touch charms hidden beneath their cloaks before entering the churchyard gate. One woman presses garlic briefly against her sleeve. Another mutters that spirits linger near churchyards during weddings because joy attracts envy from the dead. This theory feels emotionally complicated for so early in the morning. The procession slows suddenly near the Lich Gate entrance. Voices rise ahead. You edge closer through the crowd and spot the cause almost immediately. 2 men stand arguing beside the churchyard wall, one from the bride's household, the other wearing the groom's colours. Their faces flush red in the cold air while nearby guests pretend not to stare despite staring very hard. The wagon was searched already, and yet the silver clasp is missing. Then perhaps your own servants misplaced it. My servants are not thieves. An unfortunate sentence to speak loudly beside several dozen nervous wedding guests. The priest hurries forward, attempting peace, while musicians awkwardly continue playing in the background, creating the strange effect of a cheerful soundtrack accompanying possible accusations of robbery. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether the clasp truly vanished, or whether someone merely wished to embarrass the opposing family before the vows. Either way, suspicion spreads through the crowd like cold rain through wool. The groom steps between the men before tempers worsen. His expression remains controlled, though only just. "We search later," he says firmly. "Not here." The bride stands silent nearby while wind tugs at her veil. For a moment no one moves. Then, reluctantly, the argument settles into muttering instead of shouting. The procession continues through the gate into the churchyard, but the warmth of celebration has thinned noticeably. You follow the others past crooked gravestones slick with rain. Ravens perch atop the church roof watching the gathering below with unnerving patience. A child beside you whispers, "Bad omen." His mother immediately replies, "Everything is a bad omen if you stare at it long enough." A surprisingly philosophical statement from someone carrying turnips in a basket. Inside the church porch, guests crowd together, stamping mud from boots while candles flicker against carved stone saints, worn smooth by generations of touching hands. The air smells of incense, wet wool, and cold masonry. The priest waits beside the open inner doors, robes rustling softly in the draught. Beyond him lies the dim church nave glowing with candlelight. And as the bells continue tolling above the mist-covered town, you sense that everyone entering the church carries more than wedding hopes with them this morning. They carry suspicion, old rivalries, fear of misfortune, and the uneasy knowledge that medieval weddings rarely become dangerous all at once. Usually, danger arrives step by careful step. The church swallows the wedding guests slowly, as though reluctant to accept so many damp, noisy souls at once. You step through the heavy oak doors behind the procession and immediately feel the cold settle around you again despite the candles burning along the nave. Stone churches keep winter inside themselves long after winter has technically ended. The air smells of incense, wet wool, old dust, and centuries of extinguished wax. Your boots scrape softly across uneven flagstones worn smooth by generations of pilgrims, mourners, merchants, and nervous brides. Above, shadows gather in the timbered roof where smoke from incense drifts lazily toward darkness. Narrow stained glass windows admit weak grey light, painting the misty interior with faded reds and blues. At the front of the church, beeswax candles surround the altar in trembling rows. Their reflections flicker across silver chalices and reliquaries, while a young acolyte struggles heroically not to sneeze into sacred proceedings. The wedding guests arrange themselves carefully according to rank and family loyalty. This turns out to be more complicated than arranging a battlefield. The bride's kin gather along one side of the nave beneath a carved saint holding a stone lamb. The groom's family occupies the opposite side beside an aging wall painting of the Last Judgment, where nearly everyone appears alarmed. You settle near a thick pillar streaked dark by dampness. Nearby, villagers continue whispering about the missing silver clasp from the churchyard dispute. Probably stolen during unloading. Or hidden on purpose. I heard the groom's cousin gambles. I heard the bride's uncle cheats at grain weights. Medieval gossip travels faster than plague, and with roughly the same survival rate. The bells outside finally fall silent. A hush spreads through the church. The priest steps forward. His robes rustle softly as he raises his hands above the gathered crowd. Latin prayers roll through the cold air, half understood by many present and fully ignored by at least 3 small children, already fighting over a candle stub near the rear wall. The bride and groom move toward the altar together. You watch carefully now because medieval marriage law is stranger and more fragile than most people imagine. A wedding here does not depend only on romance or ceremony. It depends upon witnesses, spoken consent, lawful agreements, church approval, and sometimes the willingness of feuding relatives not to ruin everything before noon. No one can quite agree whether medieval marriage customs are brilliantly organized or held together entirely by luck and stubbornness. The couple stops before the altar rail. The priest asks questions in solemn rhythm. Do they come willingly? Are they already promised elsewhere? Are they bound by unlawful kinship? This last concern matters deeply. Medieval people keep surprisingly detailed track of blood relations, partly because the church insists certain cousins should absolutely not marry, though the exact limits become confusing enough that entire monasteries likely survive on paperwork alone. A monk beside you quietly unrolls parchment records just in case. The bride's voice trembles slightly as she answers. The groom speaks more firmly, though he keeps glancing toward the gathered families as if expecting interruption. And interruptions happen, more often than anyone likes to admit. Sometimes a previous marriage contract appears unexpectedly. Sometimes a jealous rival objects publicly. Sometimes disputes over dowries erupt halfway through the vows. Sometimes witnesses conveniently remember important information at the worst possible moment. The priest pauses before the final exchange of consent. The entire church seems to hold its breath. Even the tawny dog has somehow entered the building and now sleeps beside a pillar near the back, without causing objection from anyone except one deeply offended nun. Then the vows are spoken. Simple words. Quiet words, but heavy ones. You notice how carefully the witnesses lean forward listening to every syllable. In this world, spoken promises carry enormous weight because written records remain rare, fragile, and often disputed. A marriage may later depend upon who heard what inside this cold stone church on a rainy morning. The couple joins hands. A ring is produced at last after several alarming moments during which one servant cannot locate the correct pouch. Panic briefly flashes across half the front pews before the ring finally appears wrapped inside linen. The priest blesses it with oil and prayer. Some swear wedding rings protect couples from wandering affection because the unbroken circle traps loyalty inside. Others insist the tradition survives simply because goldsmiths enjoy steady employment. The ring slides onto the bride's finger. Candles flicker sharply in a sudden draught. Several guests glance upward nervously. A child whispers, "Another omen." His grandmother pinches his ear without looking away from the altar. The priest continues. Latin echoes softly against damp stone while incense thickens the air. You find yourself drifting into the strange calm rhythm of the ceremony bells, prayer, candlelight, breath steaming faintly in the cold nave. Then somewhere near the rear of the church, voices rise suddenly. Not loud, but tense. Heads turn. One of the groom's cousins argues quietly with a merchant near the entrance, the missing silver clasp again. Accusations now drift openly through the church like smoke. You search my satchel already. Then why leave town so quickly afterward? I sell cloth in 3 markets before winter, and perhaps silver in a 4th. The priest closes his eyes briefly in exhausted disappointment before continuing the blessing louder than before. An experienced man. You suspect he has officiated enough weddings to understand that medieval ceremonies survive mainly through determination. The dispute settles before becoming a true disruption, but unease lingers afterward. Guests whisper behind gloved hands. One woman crosses herself repeatedly. Another touches a charm hidden beneath her sleeve. Meanwhile, the marriage proceeds toward its final blessing. The bride kneels. The groom follows. The priest lays hands over them while monastery bells begin ringing again outside, their sound rolling through the church walls in slow waves. Rain taps lightly against the windows once more. Somewhere high above, pigeons shift inside the roof beams. For a moment the entire world seems suspended between warmth and cold, blessing and suspicion, peace and trouble. Then the priest pronounces them married. A murmur spreads through the church. Relief first? Always relief. The tension breaks like ice loosening on a river. Guests exhale. Smiles finally appear more naturally. Someone near the back actually applauds before receiving several scandalized looks from older relatives. The musicians outside begin playing again. The bride rises slowly beside her husband. Husband now. The word changes everything around her instantly: property rights, household duties, alliances, expectations, dangers. A servant hurries forward with fur-lined cloaks for the couple as guests begin moving toward the doors. The church grows noisy once more with scraping boots and rustling wool. You linger briefly near the pillar while candles continue burning beside the altar. The Tourneur dog wakes, stretches proudly, and wanders after the crowd like a saintly guardian of poor decisions. Outside waits the feast. The ale, the dancing, the arguments not yet finished. And somewhere beneath all of it, hidden carefully beneath blessings and celebration, the uneasy knowledge that the wedding has survived the vows but not necessarily the day. The church doors swing open, and the wedding crowd spills back into the wet grey daylight, with the slow, chaotic energy of livestock escaping a pen. Bells continue ringing overhead, while the newly married couple steps carefully through the churchyard mud beneath a canopy of cloaks and raised lanterns. The rain has softened into mist now, drifting through the air in pale threads that cling to fur collars and eyelashes. Guests cheer as the bride and groom emerge, though the cheering sounds slightly tired from cold fingers and empty stomachs. Several villagers toss dried herbs into the air. One child flings oats so enthusiastically that half the grains land inside a monk's hood. The monk says nothing, which may be the clearest evidence of sainthood you witness all day. You join the procession returning toward the manor hall. The musicians play louder now, pipes wheezing cheerfully while drums echo off the narrow town streets. Townsfolk lean from upper windows to watch the married couple pass below. A baker's apprentice waves a loaf of bread overhead like a ceremonial banner before being shouted at by his master. The mood has improved since the tenth ceremony, though not completely. You still catch fragments of suspicion moving through the crowd like cold draughts beneath a door. Merchant looked nervous. A silver clasp worth half a cow. Never trust wedding guests from river towns. Yet hunger begins overpowering scandal. The smell reaches you before the manor itself does. Roasting meat, onions simmering in fat, fresh bread warming near hearthstones. Even the most suspicious medieval guest becomes easier to manage once properly fed. By the time you enter the manor courtyard again, servants hurry everywhere carrying platters, casks, bundles of firewood, and enough trenchers to outfit a small army. Smoke pours thickly from the kitchen vents, while stable boys struggle to keep restless horses calm amid the growing noise. Inside the great hall, warmth crashes over you in waves. The room looks transformed since morning. Fresh candles burn along the walls. Evergreen branches hang from beams overhead to sweeten the smoky air. New rushes cover the floor, though several muddy boots immediately begin ruining the effort. Long trestle tables stretch across the hall beneath soot-black rafters. Earthenware cups, wooden spoons, and trenchers made from stale bread wait beside piles of salt and herbs. At the centre hearth, spits turn slowly above glowing coals where rabbits and geese roast to dripping perfection. A servant carrying ale nearly collides with you. "Move unless you wish to wear supper," she snaps. A fair warning. Guests settle themselves according to rank while subtle territorial battles immediately begin over the best benches near the fire. One old knight occupies nearly twice the necessary space using only his elbows and personal bitterness. You find a place farther down among merchants, retainers, distant cousins, and one travelling pilgrim who appears determined to nap directly into his soup. At the high table, the bride and groom finally sit side by side beneath banners illuminated by candlelight. The bride looks pale but calmer now. Her husband speaks quietly with her while servants arrange dishes before them. The feast begins with pottage thick enough to stand a spoon upright inside. Coarse bread follows, then smoked fish, soft cheese, roasted roots glazed in honey, and dark ale ladled generously into cups that never remain empty for long. You tear apart warm bread while conversation rises steadily around the hall. And now, finally, people begin telling stories. Medieval feasts thrive on stories almost as much as food. Travellers recount dangerous roads, merchants exaggerate profits, old soldiers repeat battles that improve slightly every winter. Across from you, a wool trader insists he once saw a wedding procession attacked by geese possessed by demons. "Ordinary geese are bad enough," someone replies. No one argues further. Near the hearth, musicians strike up quicker tunes while servants circulate with pitchers of mulled wine scented faintly with cloves. Candlelight flickers warmly across damp stone walls. Outside, twilight gathers early beyond the shutters. The Tournier dog patrols beneath the tables collecting fallen scraps with impressive efficiency. At one point it steals half a sausage directly from beneath a sleeping guest's hand without waking him. A legendary criminal. The feast continues in rolling waves of noise and warmth. Cups slam against wood, boots scrape through rushes, smoke drifts overhead in slow clouds while shadows leap against the rafters. Yet even amid celebration, the dangers surrounding medieval weddings remain strangely visible. At the neighbouring table, two men argue quietly over inheritance rights tied to the marriage. Near the doorway, one servant accuses another of pocketing silver spoons. A girl cries after burning her hand on spilled grease. An elderly aunt insists the bride must not sneeze during supper or the marriage will suffer financial ruin. Unfortunately, the bride immediately sneezes. Half the table freezes. The aunt mutters prayers into her cup while another woman hurriedly throws salt across the hearth fire. You begin suspecting medieval life involves approximately 80% reacting to random events with emergency rituals. Meanwhile, the groom attempts to maintain cheerful dignity despite increasing drunkenness among his relatives. One cousin stands to deliver a toast and nearly falls backward into the musicians. To marriage, he shouts. To stable roofs. To healthy cows. The order feels revealing. Guests roar with laughter anyway. Further down the hall, a pair of young servants carry out an enormous roasted boar decorated with apples and herbs. The crowd erupts into applause loud enough to shake dust from the beams overhead. For a little while, warmth overtakes anxiety. People eat, drink, laugh. Even the suspicious merchant accused earlier of theft now shares wine with the groom's uncle, while discussing river tolls and poor weather. Perhaps peace truly might survive the evening. Then suddenly a cup shatters somewhere near the centre tables. Conversation falters. A young retainer rises abruptly, face flushed red with ale and anger. You insult my family again, and I'll answer properly. Across from him another man stands as well. I spoke truth. Chairs scrape sharply across stone. The musicians stop playing mid-note. Around the hall, guests exchange exhausted expressions that seem to say, "Ah, yes, here we are at last." Because no medieval wedding feast remains peaceful forever once enough ale enters the room. Seating arrangements alone can start feuds lasting decades. Add inheritance disputes, wounded pride, exhaustion, and strong drink. And suddenly every table becomes a battlefield politely disguised with candles. The groom rises quickly before tempers worsen. Servants move discreetly toward the argument. The bride lowers her eyes. Outside, wind rattles the shutters again while darkness thickens beyond the hall walls. And as voices rise carefully beneath the warm glow of candlelight, you begin to understand why surviving a medieval wedding often required far more than simply reaching the altar. The hall stills around the argument the way a forest stills before heavy rain. Not silent entirely, candles continue crackling. Trenchers scrape faintly. Someone coughs near the hearth, but every guest now listens with careful attention while pretending not to. The two men stand facing one another between the crowded tables. One belongs to the groom's household, broad-shouldered and flushed from ale. The other wears the colours of the bride's kin and grips his cup so tightly you suspect it may soon become several smaller cups. The groom steps forward first. "Sit down," he says evenly. "A simple request." Medieval people rarely treat simple requests simply. The second man snorts. "Tell your cousin to hold his tongue. Then." Several guests quietly begin moving breakable objects farther away. Wise instincts. You notice servants exchanging resigned glances as though this exact scene has occurred at every wedding since the invention of fermented grain. One older cook near the kitchen doors continues slicing onions without even looking up. Experience has hardened her. The musicians sit frozen beside the hearth, clutching instruments uncertainly. A fiddler seems prepared to flee at remarkable speed if chairs begin flying. The bride remains seated at the high table, hands folded tightly in her lap. Candlelight flickers across her pale expression, while women beside her whisper prayers beneath their breath. No one can quite agree whether arguments during wedding feasts predict future misfortune or merely prove that enough ale has been served. Perhaps both. The groom's cousin finally speaks again. "You accuse us openly before guests and clergy." "I accuse thieves openly," the other man replies. "Ah, yes." The missing silver clasp returns once more like a determined ghost. Murmurs spread across nearby benches. Several guests lean forward eagerly now that the dispute contains both alcohol and alleged crime, the two favourite ingredients of medieval storytelling. The accused merchant from earlier suddenly rises from a side table. "I took nothing." Unfortunately, standing up during accusations rarely improves appearances. 3 people begin talking at once. Someone swears they saw the clasp near the wagons before dawn. Another insists it vanished after the church ceremony. A third claims suspicious strangers entered the courtyard during the rain. The Tournier dog wanders calmly through the middle of the tension carrying a chicken bone. A creature beyond earthly concerns. The priest finally intervenes, lifting one weary hand. Enough. His voice cuts through the hall surprisingly well for a man who looks permanently exhausted by humanity. This is a wedding feast, not a manor court. A knight near the hearth mutters, "Give it time." Several guests suppress laughter badly. The priest orders the matter delayed until morning. Witnesses will speak then if necessary, for tonight, peace must hold. Reluctantly the men sit. Ale flows again. Conversation returns in cautious waves. But the mood has shifted now. The warmth of celebration carries sharp edges beneath it. Guests watch one another more carefully. Hands remain closer to knives hanging at belts. Smiles appear slower than before. You continue eating roasted goose while observing the hall settle uneasily back into motion. Servants refill cups with determined optimism. Musicians resume playing softer tunes. Somewhere near the kitchens, someone drops an entire tray and receives language from the cook inventive enough to threaten several saints simultaneously. The feast pushes onward because medieval life rarely pauses for emotional comfort. At your table, an elderly traveller begins explaining old wedding customs between mouthfuls of cheese. In some villages, he says, they lock the church doors after vows until both families exchange gifts properly. Why? So no one escapes the contract. A practical society. Another guest claims that in the north, brides once carried small iron keys hidden beneath their sleeves to protect themselves from wandering spirits during the wedding night. Did it work, someone asks. The traveller shrugs. Depends whether the spirits respected locksmithing. Around the hall, drinking deepens steadily. Faces redden, voices grow louder. One merchant attempts singing and is discouraged by nearly everyone within hearing distance. Meanwhile, servants carry out fresh platters, roasted turnips glazed with honey, smoked river trout, oat cakes dripping with butter, and bowls of stewed apples spiced faintly with cinnamon imported at outrageous expense. You notice how carefully the Lord Steward watches the room throughout the meal. His eyes move constantly from table to table, counting cups, measuring tempers, tracking potential trouble before it grows teeth. Large feasts are dangerous for more reasons than violence. Fire remains a constant threat in crowded timber halls lit by dozens of candles and open hearths. Food spoils easily. Ale clouds judgment. Guests wander into the wrong sleeping spaces. Valuable gifts disappear. And tonight nearly every risk sits openly inside this hall at once. Near the entrance, 2 retainers quietly escort a drunken guest outside after he mistakes another man's wife for his own cousin. To be fair, everyone is wearing approximately the same brown wool. The bride finally rises from the high table or a ceremonial toast. The hall quiets again as she lifts a silver cup with careful hands. She speaks softly but clearly enough. To peace between households. A good choice of words. Guests raise cups in answer. Spills across tables. Candlelight glimmers on damp wood and polished metal while musicians strike gentle chords behind her speech. For a moment the hall softens again. You almost believe the evening may end peacefully after all. Then one of the groom's younger brothers begins losing heavily at dice near the hearth. Never trust a medieval feast that includes gambling after midnight. Coins clatter across the table while a circle of guests gathers eagerly around the game. Arguments erupt almost immediately over counting marks properly. One player accuses another of loaded dice. Someone demands witnesses. The young brother slams his cup down hard enough to spill wine across the rushes. "You cheat!" The other man grins lazily. "You lose." An extremely dangerous distinction. The steward intervenes before fists follow. Dice vanish. Players separate grumbling into opposite corners of the hall. The bride closes her eyes briefly like someone discovering marriage includes far more administrative duties than expected. Outside, wind rises again around the manor walls. You hear shutters banging somewhere in the courtyard while rain returns lightly against the roof. Inside, the feast burns onward beneath smoke-black rafters and wavering candles. Guests eat more slowly now. Some drift towards sleep beside the hearth. Others continue drinking with stubborn determination despite obvious consequences approaching. A woman near you quietly ties red thread around her wrist to ward away envy before the bedding ceremony later tonight. Another guest spits lightly into the fire for luck. Some swear weddings attract malicious spirits because joy itself draws attention from dark things wandering beyond the hearthlight. Others insist drunken cousins are the greater danger. Looking around the hall, you suspect history strongly supports the second theory. And as midnight edges closer while arguments smoulder beneath forced laughter and rising smoke, you begin to feel the strange truth medieval people understand well. A wedding feast does not truly end when the food disappears. It ends only when everyone survives the night. By the time midnight settles fully over the manor, the feast has softened into something slower and stranger. The sharp energy of arguments and toasts fades beneath exhaustion, wine fumes, and the dreamy haze created by too many candles burning too long in smoky air. The hall glows gold beneath the rafters. Wax drips steadily down iron holders. Shadows sway across damp stone walls. The musicians near the hearth now play gentler tunes on fiddle and pipe, while half the guests sing several beats behind the melody. You remain near the centre tables watching servants clear away trenchers soaked through with grease and ale. Rushes stick damply beneath boots. Someone sleeps beneath a bench clutching a loaf of bread protectively against his chest like a holy relic. The Tournier dog lies beside him equally content. Outside, rain whispers softly against the shutters. Occasionally wind slips beneath the eaves carrying the cold scent of wet earth and distant wood smoke into the hall. And now the dancing begins properly. A drummer taps a quicker rhythm while younger guests rise eagerly from benches. Cloaks are tossed aside, sleeves rolled back, cups abandoned temporarily in favour of the movement. You step closer to the open space near the hearth where rushes have been cleared for dancing. Firelight flashes across spinning figures while boots stamp the floor in rough rhythm. Laughter rises more freely now, loosened by warmth and exhaustion. The bride joins reluctantly at first, guided by older women toward the centre of the hall. The groom follows, less graceful but determined. No one expects elegance. This is medieval dancing, and survival counts as success. A circle forms around them. Guests clap in uneven time while musicians scrape fiercely at strings. The bride's blue gown flickers through the smoke and torchlight like moving water. Her veil shifts loose around her shoulders as she turns. For a little while, joy finally feels real. Not negotiated. not blessed under tension. Simply real. You notice even the suspicious glances between families begin softening around the edges. Ale helps. Music helps more. Then, an elderly aunt loudly warns the bride not to dance too near the hearth, or her first child will supposedly inherit a wandering spirit. The bride politely steps farther away from the fire. No one can quite agree how medieval people survived daily life while carrying enough superstitions to terrify themselves every 10 minutes. A young servant girl joins the dance next, cheeks flushed red with excitement. One of the groom's cousins twirls her too quickly and nearly sends both of them crashing into a table. Guests roar with laughter, while cups wobble dangerously. Further along the wall, older villagers remain seated watching with the grave seriousness of judges overseeing livestock inspections. They dance too wildly, one mutters. They dance young, another replies. This seems to settle the matter. The musicians continue playing while more guests join the circle. Boots pound the floorboards overhead, where late arrivals search for sleeping space in the lofts. Somewhere near the kitchens, cooks scrape burnt fat from roasting trays while complaining softly about tomorrow's cleaning. You drift toward the edge of the dancers where mulled wine is served from steaming pitchers. The spice sweetness cuts through the smoky air pleasantly. Beside you, a travelling peddler explains another wedding belief in hushed tones. In some villages, if the bride stumbles during dancing, her marriage becomes unlucky. You glance toward the crowded floor where at least 6 people nearly fall simultaneously. Then all marriages are doomed, you reply. The peddler nods thoughtfully. Perhaps that explains much. Near the centre of the hall, the groom dances now with the bride's younger sister, while the bride herself is passed ceremonially between guests. This tradition supposedly spreads good fortune among the community. It also spreads exhaustion remarkably efficiently. A monk standing near the wall pretends not to enjoy the music while tapping one foot invisibly beneath his robes. You respect the effort. As the dancing continues, the hall grows warmer despite the weather outside. Windows fog faintly from heat and breath. Candles burn lower, hair loosens. Laughter becomes softer, more intimate. And beneath this all moves another current entirely. Flirtation. Weddings gather unmarried guests together under candlelight with music, wine, and poor judgment. Medieval moralists complain about this constantly for very understandable reasons. You notice 2 servants disappearing briefly into the corridor near the kitchens before returning separately, trying very hard to appear innocent. A young knight spends suspiciously long adjusting the ribbons on a merchant's daughter's sleeve. Meanwhile, an old grandmother watches everyone with terrifying accuracy. Nothing escapes her. At one point she mutters, "That boy will regret springtime," while chewing roasted chestnuts. You do not ask questions. The bride eventually returns breathless to the high table, while women fuss around her with cups of watered wine and cloth scented with herbs. One servant presses lavender against her wrists to calm nerves before the bedding rituals later. At the mention of the bedding ceremony, the mood shifts again slightly. Excitement mixes uneasily with embarrassment. Because medieval weddings do not end quietly after dancing. They continue into strange communal customs modern people would flee from at tremendous speed. Guests begin singing slower songs now, many of them deeply sentimental or mildly inappropriate depending on the verse remembered. One drunk uncle attempts harmony and achieves something closer to agricultural distress. Still, no one stops him. The storm outside strengthens again. Wind rattles the shutters hard enough to make several candles flicker wildly. One goes out entirely near the rear wall. Immediate silence follows. A woman crosses herself. Another throws salt over her shoulder. The candle is relit quickly from the hearth while guests murmur nervously. Bad air, someone insists. Restless spirits, another whispers. Even now, it's hard to tell whether fear creates omens or omens create fear. The bride watches the relit candle carefully for several moments afterward. Then the musicians begin one final dance. Slower this time. Gentler. Couples move through the smoky glow while the hall settles gradually toward midnight weariness. Boots scrape softly across rushes. Rain hums against the roof. Beyond the walls, distant watchmen call the hour through the dark town streets. You notice the groom speaking quietly with the steward near the hearth. Both glance toward the corridors leading deeper into the manor. Preparations continue. Beds warmed with heated stones. Candles arranged. Witnesses chosen. Because soon the hall's laughter and music will give way to one of the strangest and most uncomfortable traditions medieval weddings preserve. And as the final dance turns slowly beneath the wavering candlelight, you sense the entire feast holding its breath once more, waiting for the night to cross another threshold. The final notes of the dance fade slowly into the rafters while the manor hall settles into a thick, smoky hush. Guests lower themselves onto benches with exhausted groans. Candles burn shorter now, their flames wavering low in puddles of wax. The air feels heavy with heat, damp wool, wine, and the lingering scent of roasted herbs scattered earlier across the hearth. Outside, rain continues whispering against the shutters. Inside, everyone waits, because the wedding feast has reached the moment many medieval guests anticipate with terrible enthusiasm, and the bride anticipates with understandable dread. The bedding ritual. No one can quite agree how this custom becomes normal. You watch servants begin rearranging the hall with practiced efficiency. Trenchers are stacked aside, benches dragged back, lanterns gathered. Older women whisper instructions while younger guests suddenly become far too interested in events upstairs. The bride sits quietly at the high table while several women surround her carrying folded linens, candles, sprigs of rosemary, and heated stones wrapped in cloth to warm the marriage bed. One aunt pats the bride's shoulder gently. Another offers wine. A third warns her not to cry too much tonight, or sorrow will settle permanently into the household walls. A comforting tradition overall. Meanwhile, the groom receives equally questionable advice from increasingly drunk relatives near the hearth. Do not remove your boots too quickly. Always sleep nearest the wall in winter. Never trust geese. The last instruction receives solemn agreement from several men for reasons no one explains. You drift toward the staircase leading to the upper chambers where guests gather with open curiosity. In noble households, the bedding ceremony often serves partly as proof that the marriage is publicly recognized and properly completed. Witnesses matter enormously in medieval life. Privacy matters somewhat less, which must have been exhausting. The Tournier dog trots ahead of the crowd as though personally invited. Lantern light flickers along narrow stone corridors upstairs. The walls sweat faintly with dampness. Guests squeeze shoulder to shoulder while servants carry linens toward the bridal chamber at the far end. You catch glimpses inside as the door opens briefly. A large oak bed stands against the wall beneath heavy wool blankets dyed dark red. Beeswax candles burn in iron holders nearby. Rosemary hangs from the bedposts beside small carved crosses. A bowl of warmed wine rests on a stool beside the hearth, where herbs smoulder softly over coals. Some swear rosemary protects newlyweds from envy and evil spirits alike. Others insist it mostly hides the smell of nervous sweating. Likely both. The bride finally rises from downstairs and approaches the chamber, surrounded by women singing old wedding songs, in voices softened by wine and fatigue. The melody echoes strangely through the corridor. The groom follows behind amid louder, far less graceful encouragement from his companions. One drunken cousin attempts a blessing and accidentally insults the saints instead. A monk quietly pretends not to hear. At the doorway, the older women pause to perform several final rituals. One circles the bride with a candle 3 times to ward off ill fortune. Another tucks herbs beneath the pillow. A third places a small iron key under the bed for protection against wandering spirits. Even now, it's hard to tell whether medieval households fear ghosts, curses, bad luck, infertility, jealous neighbours, or simply the future itself. Perhaps all of them together. The bride's veil is carefully removed while guests murmur approvingly. Several women begin unfastening the outer layers of her gown with ceremonial slowness, while trying to maintain modesty in front of 30 fascinated spectators. Not an easy assignment. The groom fares no better. His brothers tug away cloak and belt while loudly debating whether marriage improves a man's character or merely shortens his sleep. Both, an old knight mutters from the corridor wall. The room laughs. The bride manages a faint smile at last. For a moment the mood becomes strangely warm, despite the awkwardness communal, tired, human. Candles glow softly against stone walls while rain taps the narrow windows. Guests sway gently from wine and exhaustion. Even the priest looks less stern now. Then someone notices the Tourneur dog sitting proudly atop the marriage bed. The entire corridor erupts into laughter loud enough to wake nearby servants. A maid shoos the dog away while one grandmother immediately declares it a sign of prosperity. Another insists dogs near wedding beds predict stubborn children. A third claims it means nothing at all except that someone left sausage unattended downstairs. The dog departs with dignity intact. At last the couple is guided toward the bed itself while witnesses linger nearby. In some places guests remain until the newlyweds lie fully beneath the blankets. In others, prayers are spoken first. Customs vary wildly from village to village. Tonight the priest steps forward with one final blessing. He sprinkles holy water lightly across the bedposts and murmurs Latin prayers while candlelight trembles around the chamber. Steam rises faintly from damp cloaks drying near the hearth. You notice the bride clasping the rosemary charm still tied around her wrist. Nervous fingers. Cold hands. Human fear beneath layers of ritual. Because for all the feasting and music, marriage here changes life completely. A woman leaves her household. Property shifts. Duties multiply. Children are expected. Entire futures hinge on harvests. Illness. Loyalty. Survival. No wonder medieval weddings feel dangerous. The blessing finishes. Guests begin backing slowly toward the corridor while singing grows softer and more teasing. One aunt tosses nuts onto the bed for fertility. Another warns the groom never to sleep with cold feet if he hopes for sons. The groom nods solemnly as though receiving military instructions. Finally, the chamber door closes. A cheer rises through the hallway. Then, almost immediately, everyone becomes awkwardly uncertain what to do next. Several guests shuffle downstairs in embarrassed silence. Others continue laughing too loudly from leftover wine and nerves. One old woman remains near the door, listening critically until dragged away by relatives. The corridor gradually empties. Candles dim lower. Rain beats harder now against the shutters while wind moans faintly through cracks in the stone. You descend once more into the great hall where only a fraction of the guests remain awake beside the dying hearth fires. Some sleep wrapped in cloaks beneath tables. Others nurse final cups of ale while musicians quietly pack away instruments. The manor has grown calmer at last. Or so it seems. Because beyond the warm hall walls, beyond the watchfires flickering atop the gatehouse, beyond the rain-dark roads leading through forest and marsh, the medieval night still waits patiently with all its hidden dangers intact. And before dawn arrives, This wedding will discover that not every threat comes from inside the feast. The manor hall sinks gradually into the exhausted silence that follows great gatherings. Not true silence, of course. Medieval buildings never entirely sleep. Somewhere a servant scrapes bowls clean beside the kitchens. Rainwater drips steadily from roof gutters outside. A man snores beneath the high table with astonishing commitment. Embers shift softly in the hearth like breathing. You settle closer to the fire, wrapping your cloak tighter against the creeping cold that seeps through the stone floor after midnight. Most guests have drifted away now, some to lofts crowded with straw pallets, others to corners of the hall where wool blankets and exhaustion matter more than comfort. The torn-ear dog sleeps beside the hearth with its paws twitching faintly in dreams. A peaceful moment, finally. Yet the manor does not fully relax. You notice it first among the retainers near the doorway. They continue glancing toward the courtyard between murmured conversations. One checks the latch bar twice. Another sharpens a knife slowly against whetstone while listening to the storm outside. Because weddings may end inside the hall, but danger still walks the roads beyond the walls. Wind rattles the shutters hard enough to make candle flames bend sideways. Rain lashes briefly against the roof before easing again into steady dripping. Somewhere beyond the gatehouse, a horse snorts sharply. A guard crosses the courtyard carrying a lantern. Then another follows. You watch the movement carefully now. Something has unsettled them. Near the hearth, an old traveller wrapped in patched wool notices your attention and shifts closer with his cup of ale. "Bad weather for roads," he mutters. You ask whether travellers still arrive this late. "Sometimes travellers," he replies, "sometimes worse." That is the entire explanation. A deeply medieval form of reassurance. The old man tells you quietly that wedding feasts often attract unwanted attention during winter months. Thieves know guests carry silver gifts and fine clothing. Hungry deserters roam the forests after failed campaigns. Rival families occasionally choose celebrations as ideal moments for revenge. No one expects trouble during dancing, he says. A fair tactical observation. Outside, a distant shout echoes faintly through the rain. The retainers near the doorway stiffen immediately. Several sleeping guests wake halfway, blinking in confusion. One monk crosses himself before fully understanding why. Another shout follows. Closer now. The hall begins stirring uneasily. A guard hurries inside, trailing rainwater across the rushes. Riders near the eastern road. Conversation stops. Not panic exactly. Medieval people live too close to uncertainty for instant panic. Instead, the mood changes into something tighter, sharper, more alert. The steward rises at once. How many? Could not tell in the dark. Wonderful. The retainers gather near the entrance while servants quietly begin securing shutters more tightly against the storm. Candles flicker in the sudden draughts. Guests wake fully now, murmuring anxiously beneath blankets and cloaks. You hear familiar words moving through the hall once again. Raiders! Bandits! Mercenaries! No one can quite agree whether the riders are truly dangerous or simply lost travellers seeking shelter. But uncertainty itself becomes its own threat in the medieval world. Roads remain lawless enough that every hoofbeat after midnight feels suspicious. The groom descends from the upper chambers still wearing only part of his cloak, face tense with exhaustion and irritation. So much for a peaceful wedding night. The bride remains upstairs under guard of her women while the hall reorganizes itself rapidly beneath torchlight. Men check weapons. Doors are barred. Lanterns are lit along the courtyard walls. Even the priest now grips a heavy iron candlestick with concerning competence. You move toward the narrow windows overlooking the outer yard. Rain obscures most of the darkness beyond the gate, but now and then lightning flickers faintly far off across the clouds. Then you hear it. Hoofbeats. Slow. Approaching through mud. The hall stills completely. The Tornier dog lifts its head and growls low beside the hearth. Somewhere upstairs a woman whispers prayers. The riders stop outside the gatehouse. Voices call through the rain. The guards answer sharply from above the walls. Torches sway in the wind while water streams down the stone battlements. You cannot make out every word, only fragments drifting through the storm. Travellers. Bridge washed. Need shelter. The steward hesitates. Hospitality matters deeply in medieval culture, especially during storms. Turning away stranded travellers risks both scandal and spiritual guilt. Yet opening gates at night can invite disaster. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether the danger outside the walls was real or merely feared strongly enough to become real in memory afterward. The debate continues several tense minutes. Finally, the Lord gives orders. The outer gate opens only partially. 2 riders enter under armed watch while the others remain outside beyond the torchlight. You glimpse them briefly through the rain, mud-covered cloaks, exhausted horses, faces shadowed beneath hoods. One carries an injured arm bound tightly with cloth darkened by water. Or blood. Hard to tell. The strangers are brought into the lower gatehouse first while guards search their packs carefully. Every guest in the hall waits listening to muffled voices beyond the doors. The bride's uncle mutters, "Bad omen." Another man replies, "Everything tonight is a bad omen according to someone. Also fair." At last the steward returns. Merchants, apparently. Their wagon broke near the flooded eastern bridge. They seek warmth until dawn. Relief spreads unevenly through the hall, though suspicion lingers stubbornly around the edges. The strangers are allowed inside under watch while servants grudgingly bring hot broth and dry blankets. One of the travellers notices the wedding decorations still hanging overhead. "Married tonight?" he asks. The groom nods. The traveller gives a tired smile, "Then may your troubles end before morning." A dangerous sentence in any story. Still, the hall relaxes little by little once more. Weapons lower. Guests return to benches and blankets. The retainers remain watchful, but the immediate fear passes like the worst edge of the storm outside. Rain softens again. The hearth crackles warmly. You sit once more beside the fire while the travellers dry their cloaks nearby. One produces a tiny carved saint from his pouch and places it carefully beside his cup before sleeping. Protection for the road ahead, or perhaps for whatever still follows behind him through the dark. Above the hall, the bridal chamber remains quiet. Beyond the manor walls, watchfires burn atop the gatehouse while muddy roads vanish into forest soaked black beneath the rain. And as the exhausted wedding guests drift slowly back toward uneasy sleep, you begin to understand another danger medieval weddings carry so often. Not merely violence or theft or feuds, but the constant uncertainty of a world where every storm, stranger, and midnight hoofbeat might change the entire course of the night. Dawn creeps reluctantly across the manor like watered milk poured over cold stone. After the long night of rain, the sky outside hangs pale and swollen with low clouds while mist gathers thickly beyond the walls. You wake to the smell of wet ashes, stale ale, and oat porridge already simmering once more near the kitchens. Someone nearby groans as though personally betrayed by wine. Another guest sleeps face down on a bench with one boot missing entirely. The Tornier dog now possesses the missing boot. A creature of opportunity. The great hall looks weary in daylight. Candles have burned down into twisted pools of wax. Rushes lie flattened and stained beneath muddy footprints. Half-empty cups clutter the tables beside abandoned bones and crumbs. Smoke drifts lazily upward through pale morning light entering the narrow windows. And despite the exhaustion settling over everyone, the wedding's troubles have not disappeared overnight. They have simply become administrative, which may be worse. The steward moves through the hall already carrying parchments beneath one arm while summoning witnesses with grim efficiency. Servants clear tables for what appears less a breakfast gathering and more the beginning of a legal inquiry, because the missing silver clasp remains missing, and now several guests claim other items vanished during the feast as well. A spoon. A purse. One woman insists someone stole an entire wheel of cheese, though this accusation receives less urgency than the others. You warm your hands near the hearth while monastery bells ring faintly across the damp morning air outside. Their slow tolling sounds tired today, as though even the monks slept poorly after the storm. The groom descends first from the upper chambers. He looks exactly like a man who married yesterday and spent the night listening for trouble downstairs. The bride follows later, surrounded by older women carrying fresh linens and herbal tea. Her expression remains composed, though pale with exhaustion. One aunt whispers approvingly after glimpsing the couple together. Proof enough, apparently. Medieval weddings contain an astonishing amount of collective interest in matters no one actually wishes to discuss directly. Breakfast is served quickly, thick oat pottage, coarse bread, smoked herring, and watered ale. Guests eat quietly while the steward begins calling people one by one toward the far end of the hall. The manor court forms informally beneath the Lord's chair. Not a true court session, perhaps, but close enough to make everyone nervous. You drift nearer with the others as testimony begins. The merchant accused during the feast swears innocence immediately. A servant claims she saw strangers near the wagons after midnight. One drunken cousin remembers absolutely nothing useful except losing at dice and insulting a chair. Another guest insists the clasp never existed at all. This theory is rejected quickly because several people distinctly remember admiring it during the church procession. No one can quite agree whether medieval legal proceedings seek truth, peace, or simply exhaustion strong enough that everyone eventually stops arguing. The steward scratches notes onto parchment while witnesses talk over one another beneath drifting hearth smoke. Outside, carts creak through the courtyard as some guests prepare for departure. Wedding celebrations rarely last long for travellers. Roads remain dangerous, inns expensive, and winter weather unforgiving. A group of pilgrims already packs their belongings near the gatehouse. One ties a small saint's medal onto his satchel before leaving. Protection against robbers, perhaps. Or poor weather. Or conversation. The bride's father rises eventually, voice hard with restrained anger. "The clasp belonged to my grandmother." Murmurs spread across the hall. Ah, not merely silver, then. Family memory. Inheritance. Prestige. Objects carry enormous emotional weight here because so few valuable things survive long enough to become old. A silver clasp passed through. Generations become something close to history itself. The groom responds carefully. My household will repay the value if necessary. An honourable offer. Unfortunately, honour rarely repairs wounded pride completely. The bride finally speaks for the first time during the proceedings. Enough! The hall quiets immediately. She stands beside the high table wrapped in a dark wool cloak, while pale daylight touches the side of her face through the narrow windows. It is the morning after our wedding, she says softly. Let there be peace before more damage is done than silver can mend. A wise statement. Possibly the wisest spoken since yesterday began. The priest nods approvingly. Several guests lower their eyes in embarrassment. Even the steward seems relieved at the possibility of ending this matter before lunchtime. Then one of the travellers from last night steps forward unexpectedly. "The clasp," he says, "may have fallen near the eastern gate." Every head turns toward him. He explains that while entering during the storm, he noticed something glittering in the mud beside the wagon ruts, but assumed it worthless in the dark. The hall explodes into motion instantly. Servants rush outside carrying lanterns despite the daylight gloom. Guests crowd near the courtyard doors trying to see through the mist and drizzle. Someone nearly slips into a water trough. After several tense minutes, a stable boy returns running breathlessly through the gate. The silver clasp hangs from his muddy fingers. A roar of relieved laughter fills the hall. The bride's father nearly collapses with gratitude. The accused merchant looks deeply vindicated and slightly offended. Several guests immediately begin pretending they never accused anyone at all. An ancient human tradition. The steward wipes both hands over his face in exhausted disbelief. "Found in the mud," the stable boy announces proudly. Apparently the clasp simply fell from a wagon during yesterday's confusion. So after an entire night of suspicion, accusations, omens, and near feuds, the great threat to the wedding turns out to be poor fastening and heavy rain. History feels strangely believable again. The hall's mood lightens almost instantly afterward. Guests laugh more freely, cups refill. Even the groom smiles properly for what may be the first time since entering the church yesterday morning. The bride accepts the cleaned clasp carefully from her father. For a moment, warmth returns fully to the manor. Yet beneath the relief lingers another truth. Medieval people know well danger often leaves traces even after it passes. Harsh words remain remembered. Suspicion changes how families look at one another. Tiny fractures survive beneath restored peace. Outside the manor walls, travellers continue preparing to leave despite the drizzle. Wagons creak, horses stamp impatiently. Roads stretch outward through forest and marsh beneath the grey winter sky. The wedding feast has ended. Now comes the journey home. And journeys, in this world, may prove more dangerous than the wedding itself. The relief over the recovered silver clasp lingers in the hall like the last warmth of a fading fire. For a little while, everyone behaves more kindly than usual, which is often what people do when they have nearly accused one another into disaster and would rather not remember it too clearly. Cups are refilled, bread is shared. The stable boy who found the clasp receives so many scraps of roasted meat that the Tournier dog follows him with intense professional interest. By mid-morning, the manor begins loosening its hold on the wedding guests. Cloaks are shaken out, saddlebags are tied, horses are led from the stable steaming faintly in the cold air. Servants carry empty trenchers back toward the kitchens and the great hall, once crowded with candles, songs, arguments, and dancing, begins looking strangely large and tired. You stand near the courtyard gate watching departures gather shape beneath the grey sky. Rain has paused, though water still drips from eaves and collects in the wheel ruts. The town beyond the manor wall smells of wet timber, dung, smoke, and fresh bread cooling in shop windows. Bells from the abbey ring the next hour across the river mist, slow and hollow. The bride remains near the entrance of the hall with her new husband, receiving farewells from relatives who embrace her too tightly and whisper advice that ranges from tender to deeply alarming. One aunt presses a bundle of dried sage into her hand for household harmony. Another tells her never to sweep after sunset or she may sweep luck out the door. No one can quite agree whether luck is so fragile that it can be removed by a broom, but no one seems eager to test the matter. The departing guests form small groups according to road, kinship, and mutual distrust. Some head toward the western farms, others plan to take the market road south, A few pilgrims and merchants intend to follow the abbey track until it meets the old Roman way, where milestones still stand half sunk in mud like broken teeth. You join a group leaving by the north gate, partly because they have room beside a wool cart, and partly because the tawny dog has chosen that direction, with the confidence of a creature who has never once paid a toll. At the gate, townsfolk gather to watch the travellers depart. A peddler sells last-minute charms from beneath a patched awning pewter saints, red thread bracelets, little packets of salt, and tiny carved hands said to protect against theft. He offers you one with a serious nod. Good against bad roads. You ask whether it also works against bad drivers. He squints at you, mostly against demons. Close enough. Outside the walls, the road bends past winter fields where frost still clings in shaded furrows. The wedding banners fade behind you as the town grows smaller, its roof smoking gently beneath the grey morning. Mud sucks at wheels. Horses lower their heads and pull steadily. The cart beside you creaks with each rut, carrying blankets, empty ale casks, and a tired cousin sleeping upright against a sack of barley. The pilgrims walk nearby with scallop badges pinned to their cloaks, staff tips tapping softly into the wet ground. One carries news from the road, and soon conversation begins drifting among the travellers. By noon, the wedding has already become a story. Not yesterday's event, a story. And stories change quickly on medieval roads. The recovered clasp, once a simple accident in the mud, has already grown mysterious. One woman swears it was hidden beneath a horseshoe, which means luck returned it. A merchant insists the clasp was found only after the bride called for peace, proving her virtue carried spiritual weight. A boy claims the tawny dog dug it up, though you're fairly sure the dog spent the morning stealing herring. Some swear the strange riders at midnight were thieves scouting the manor. Others insist they were harmless merchants. Those who tell the tale never fully agree whether danger passed through the gate that night, or merely stood outside in the rain listening. The road narrows as it enters low hedges glistening with water. Birds flick from thorn to thorn. Somewhere distant, a mill wheel groans along the riverbank. The pilgrims speak of market tolls ahead, warning that the bridge-keeper charges extra for carts after storms, because medieval entrepreneurship often appears immediately after bad weather. You stop near a roadside shrine where a small wooden saint leans beneath a roof of mossy shingles. Travellers touch the post before moving on. Someone leaves a crust of bread. Someone else ties a thread around a nail hammered into the shrine beam. For safe passage, says one pilgrim. The tawny dog sniffs the bread offering with theological interest. You rest there briefly while the cartwheel is checked. A woman shares coarse bread and cheese from a cloth bundle. The cheese is hard enough to be used in minor construction, but hunger improves its reputation. Ale is passed carefully from a small flask. Hands warm around it before mouths drink. Then gossip darkens again. A peddler travelling in the opposite direction tells your group of bad ale sold at a village fair 2 days south. 3 men fell sick, he says. Another claims a jealous lover poisoned a wedding cup in the next shire. A third traveller whispers of charms buried beneath thresholds to turn brides barren. No evidence accompanies any of this. Evidence travels more slowly than rumour. Still, the stories settle around the group, making everyone glance more carefully at cups, strangers, and hedgerows. Medieval people live surrounded by uncertainty, and gossip becomes both entertainment and warning. If 1 tale in 10 is true, that may be enough to survive winter. By afternoon, the road becomes wetter where fields slope toward marshland, wheels sink deeper, men push at the cart while horses strain. Mud spatters your cloak and boots until you begin to resemble part of the landscape. The sleeping cousin finally wakes only when nearly thrown into a ditch, then complains as though the ditch has behaved rudely. Ahead, the abbey tower appears faintly through mist beyond a line of bare trees. Its bells sound again, soft and distant, calling monks to prayer and travellers toward shelter. The pilgrims grow quieter at the sight. One removes his cap. Another murmurs that abbey roads are safer because saints watch them. A merchant replies that saints may watch, but toll collectors charge. Both things can be true. As dusk approaches, the wedding party's scattered travellers begin separating toward their own roads. Farewells are called. Promises are made to visit, repay, remember, write, send wool, return borrowed knives, and absolutely not repeat certain things said during the feast. These promises vary in credibility. You continue with the smaller group toward the abbey track, where trees gather closer and the town is now only memory behind you. The wedding's warmth fades into the cold smell of wet leaves and churned earth, yet its echoes remain the candle gone out in the hall, the silver clasp shining from mud, the bride's quiet command for peace, the midnight hoofbeats beyond the gate, and as evening thickens along the road, you feel how quickly celebration becomes rumour, and rumour becomes warning, and warning becomes the kind of tale travellers tell beside fires when night is deep and the world outside feels too large. By late afternoon the road narrows into little more than 2 muddy tracks cutting through dark woodland. The open winter fields disappear behind you, replaced by damp trees leaning inward as though listening to the travellers below. Bare branches drip steadily from the morning rain, and the air smells of wet bark, moss, cold earth, and distant wood smoke carried on shifting wind. The abbey bells still sound faintly somewhere behind the hills, though softer now, almost swallowed by the forest itself. You walk beside the wool cart while the remaining travellers tighten their cloaks against the deepening cold. Wheels grind heavily through mud thick as porridge. Every few moments the horse snorts steam into the grey air and shakes rainwater from its mane. The tawny dog continues trotting ahead with the confidence of a seasoned outlaw scout. No one questions its authority anymore. The smaller company travelling this road now consists mostly of practical people, 2 merchants, a widow returning to her brother's farm, several pilgrims, the half-awake cousin from the feast, and one quiet man carrying bundles of dyed cloth strapped across a mule. And like all medieval travellers entering forest roads after rain, everyone grows more alert. Conversation lowers naturally. Eyes scan the trees. Hands rest nearer knives. Because forests carry reputations the way old churches carry incense. Stories cling to them. Warnings live there long after the people who first spoke them are gone. No one can quite agree whether medieval woods are truly full of danger or simply full of darkness deep enough for human fear to grow comfortably inside it. The pilgrims begin reciting prayers softly as the path dips beneath thicker branches. One touches a saint's badge pinned inside his cloak whenever crows burst suddenly from the trees overhead. Another traveller spits lightly over his shoulder after crossing a shallow stream. For bad spirits, he explains. You ask whether spirits fear spit. They dislike disrespect, an unexpectedly emotional weakness in supernatural creatures. The road worsens steadily. Water pools between roots. Fallen branches force the cart sideways through narrow spaces. Once, the wheel sinks nearly to its axle, and everyone must push together while boots slide hopelessly in the muck. The sleeping cousin contributes mostly advice. Rain begins again just before dusk. Not heavy this time, yet a thin cold drizzle drifting sideways through the trees. Cloaks darken, gloves soak through. The horse's ears flatten miserably. You begin understanding why medieval people associate travel with suffering and saints with endurance. Ahead, the path bends sharply around a cluster of black pines where an old roadside shrine stands half collapsed beneath moss and ivy. Someone long ago carved a saint's face into the wood, though weather has softened the features until the expression now looks uncertain. The widow pauses to leave a small copper coin there. "For my son," she murmurs. No one asks further. Those who travel medieval roads carry private grief quietly beside them, the way they carry bread or knives. The group presses onward as evening thickens beneath the forest canopy. Light fades early among the trees. Lanterns are lit one by one, their weak yellow glow trembling against wet bark and drifting mist. And then the merchant spot tracks in the mud. Fresh horse prints. Several of them. The travellers stop immediately. You gather closer while lantern light wavers across the road. The hoof prints cut sharply through the wet earth, recent enough that rain has not yet softened the edges. "Riders," one pilgrim whispers. "Hunters, perhaps," says another. But no hunting horns sound in these woods. The quiet cloth merchant finally speaks for the first time all day. Too many horses. No one argues. The group moves again, faster now but more carefully. Conversation disappears almost entirely except for warnings about roots and puddles. Lantern flames shake in the wind while the forest seems to grow darker around the edges. Somewhere deeper among the trees, a branch cracks loudly. Everyone freezes. The horse snorts hard enough to jerk the cart sideways. One pilgrim nearly drops his lantern into the mud. The torn-eared dog growls low beneath its breath. Then silence returns. Only rain. Only dripping branches. Only your own heartbeat suddenly much louder than before. No one can quite tell whether something truly moved through the trees, or whether exhaustion and old stories now travel beside the group like unseen companions. Still, several travellers quietly loosen knives from belts. The road finally climbs uphill toward a ridge where the trees thin slightly. From there you glimpse the fading world beyond the forest, distant marshland silver beneath mist, smoke rising from far farms, and somewhere very faintly the warm glow of an inn or watchfire near the southern track. Civilization exists. Probably. Behind you, the woods remain black and dripping. Then comes the howl. Long. Distant. A wolf, perhaps. Or several. The pilgrims cross themselves immediately. The widow mutters prayers beneath her hood. One merchant insists wolves rarely attack groups this large. The other replies, "Rarely comforts me less than you think." The travellers push onward faster now. Lanterns swing wildly. Mud splashes up cloaks. The horse strains harder against the cart while darkness gathers fully beneath the trees. You begin noticing how tired everyone truly is after the wedding feast. The storm, the sleepless night, the arguments, the endless roads. Fear settles more easily into exhausted bodies. Even ordinary sounds become suspicious. A snapping twig. Moving water. Wind-shifting branches overhead. At one point the torn-eared dog suddenly races into the underbrush, barking furiously. Half the travellers nearly panic before the creature emerges triumphantly chasing a terrified rabbit. The cousin falls directly into the mud during the confusion. No one helps him immediately because everyone is laughing too hard. For a moment the tension breaks. The forest feels merely wet instead of haunted. Then the rain thickens once more. Dusk collapses fully into night. And at last, far ahead through the trees, you spot the first faint lanterns hanging beside stone walls. The Abbey guest house. Warmth. Shelter. Safety, perhaps. The travellers breathe easier almost together as the bells begin ringing from within the monastery grounds. Their deep, steady sound rolls through the dark forest like a hand placed gently against a frightened shoulder. Yet even while relief spreads through the group, you glance once more toward the dripping woods behind you. And for just a moment, it seems possible that something unseen has followed the road at a careful distance all evening long, waiting patiently beyond the lantern glow where medieval fears still move quietly beneath the trees. The abbey walls rise from the darkness like something carved directly from the rain and mist. Lanterns burn beside the gatehouse arch, their warm glow trembling across wet stone while ivy clings thickly to the outer walls. Beyond them, the bells continue ringing slowly through the cold evening air, calm and steady in a way that makes your shoulders loosen before you fully realize it. After the long forest road, the sound feels almost medicinal. The travellers hurry toward the gate with renewed energy despite aching legs and soaked cloaks. Mud clings to boots in heavy layers. The horse pulling the wool cart looks moments away from writing formal complaints to heaven. A lay brother opens the gate after only brief questioning. His wool robes smell faintly of smoke and lavender as he ushers the group inside. Quickly now, he says, rain worsens after midnight. You do not ask how monks always seem to know this. The abbey courtyard glistens beneath lantern light. Rainwater drips from cloister arches into shallow stone basins, while narrow windows glow softly from within the surrounding buildings. Somewhere deeper inside the monastery grounds, monks continue chanting evening prayers in low measured voices that drift through the mist like distant humming. The travellers are led toward the guest house beside the outer cloister, a long stone building with oak shutters and a roof darkened by centuries of weather. Warmth spills from the doorway along with the smell of onion broth, damp wool drying by fires, beeswax candles, and old wood smoke soaked permanently into the beams. You step gratefully inside. The guesthouse hall is simpler than the manor you left behind, but infinitely calmer. Thick wool blankets lie folded near the walls. Rushes cover the floor more neatly here. Candles burn steadily in iron holders without drunken guests knocking them sideways every few minutes. Several monks move quietly among the travellers carrying bowls of hot pottage and rough brown bread. One brother carefully hangs soaked cloaks near the hearth, while another checks the horse outside beneath the stable awning. No one shouts. No one argues about silver clasps. No one sings badly. The contrast feels almost supernatural. You settle near the fire while steam rises faintly from your cloak. Around you, the other travellers begin thawing back into ordinary humans after the long wet road through the woods. The widow rubs warmth into stiff fingers. One merchant removes boots with the expression of a man escaping prison. The cousin from the wedding falls asleep sitting upright before even receiving his soup. The Tournier dog immediately discovers the kitchen door. A monk notices the animal and sighs with the weary patience of someone who has negotiated with stray dogs many times before. Do not let it near the smoked fish. The dog hears this as tactical information. Outside, rain taps steadily against the shutters while wind hums faintly through the cloister arches. The bells finally cease, leaving only the crackle of the hearth and the soft murmur of monks speaking Latin somewhere deeper inside the abbey. A grey-bearded brother joins you near the fire carrying a basket of dried herbs. He begins hanging bundles above the hearth to dry rosemary, sage, thyme, lavender, and bitter-smelling plants you cannot identify. For winter sickness, he explains. You ask whether they truly help. He smiles faintly, sometimes. An honest medieval medical answer at last. The monk speaks quietly while travellers eat. During hard winters, he says, the abbey guest house often shelters merchants, pilgrims, soldiers, widows, orphaned children, and occasionally fugitives pretending very hard to be pilgrims. No one can quite agree whether hospitality saves more souls than sermons, he says. The guest house settles deeper into warmth as the evening continues. Candles flicker against pale stone walls while rainwater trickles softly outside. A young novice copies records at a narrow desk near the hearth, his fingers stained with ink much like the wedding scribes yesterday. You realise how quickly the wedding already feels distant. Not forgotten, just softened by rain and road and forest. Yet its echoes linger. The monk eventually asks what brought your group to the Abbey Road during such weather. A wedding, the widow replies. At this, several monks exchange knowing expressions. Dangerous things, murmurs one. You laugh softly, assuming a joke. He does not appear to be joking. The grey-bearded brother settles onto the bench opposite you and explains that monasteries often hear the aftermath of weddings long after the feast's end. Confessions, inheritance disputes, broken agreements, illness spread through crowded halls, fights between rival households, children born too early for comfort, travellers robbed returning home. Joy gathers people together, he says quietly, and wherever people gather, trouble follows close behind. Outside, thunder rolls faintly far beyond the hills. The travellers fall gradually silent, listening to the storm. One monk distributes tiny cloth sachets filled with herbs for easier sleep, lavender for calm, mint against bad dreams, rosemary for protection. Some swear monks possess secret remedies passed down from ancient scholars. Others insist monastery medicine mostly involves prayer and hopeful leaves. Again, perhaps both. The grey-bearded monk tells another story while the fire burns lower. Years ago, he says, a wedding party sought shelter here after crossing the northern marshes. During the feast, one guest disappeared into the fog and was never found. Some believed robbers took him. Some blamed the marsh spirits local villagers feared. Even now, the monk says, it is hard to tell whether he wandered away drunk or followed something he thought he recognised in the mist. The travellers listen quietly. No one laughs, because medieval nights feel large in ways modern nights rarely do. Beyond the hearthlight waits darkness thick with uncertainty. Forests, rivers, illness, hunger, weather, strangers, memory, and weddings, despite all their music and candles, remain only small islands of warmth floating briefly against that enormous dark. The fire crackles softly. Rain eases at last. One by one, the travellers drift towards sleep beneath wool blankets spread across the guest-house floor. Monks extinguish several candles until only a few remain glowing near the hearth and shrine alcove. You lie back against folded cloaks, listening to the distant murmur of abbey prayers continuing somewhere beyond the walls. The Tourneur dog curls beside the dying fire. The wedding feast feels very far away now. Yet as sleep slowly settles over the guest house and the monastery bells ring once more through the damp midnight air, you sense how the dangers of medieval weddings never truly belonged only to the feast itself. They belong to the entire fragile world surrounding it. Morning arrives gently at the abbey, not with shouting servants or drunken cousins or arguments over missing silver, but with the low murmur of prayer drifting through stone corridors and the soft ringing of bells somewhere beyond the guest-house walls. Pale light filters through narrow shutters in long grey ribbons, touching the rushes on the floor and the wool blankets where travellers still sleep in quiet heaps beside the dying hearth. Rain has finally stopped. You wake slowly beneath the lingering scent of smoke, lavender, damp cloaks, and old timber warmed through the night. Nearby, one monk feeds fresh wood into the fire while another moves silently among the sleepers, placing cups of warm herb broth onto the benches. The Tourneur dog is already awake. Naturally. It sits near the kitchen doorway watching a novice carry smoked fish with the unwavering focus of a seasoned hunter studying prey across an open battlefield. Outside the shutters, the world sounds washed clean. Water drips softly from the cloister roofs into stone basins below. Somewhere in the orchard beyond the abbey walls, birds begin testing the morning air with uncertain songs. The storm has passed westward at last. The travellers rise slowly one by one, stiff from the road and from sleeping on floors not entirely designed for comfort. Yet the mood feels lighter now, softer. Even the weary cousin from the wedding manages only one complaint before accepting bread and broth with grateful silence. You step outside into the cloister walk while the monks continue morning prayers inside the chapel. Cool air brushes your face, carrying the smell of wet moss and distant pine woods. The abbey garden glistens beneath lingering droplets. Herbs grow in neat winter beds bordered by worn stones. Rosemary, sage, rue, mint, thyme their leaves silvered faintly by the cold. A grey-bearded monk sweeps rainwater from the path with slow, steady strokes. For a while neither of you speaks. The world itself seems quieter after the long wedding journey, quieter after the feast, the arguments, the midnight riders, the forest road. The monk finally pauses beside you. Most celebrations end this way, he says softly. You ask what he means. Tired people returning home. Simple words, true ones. Because now, with the danger behind you and dawn resting gently over the abbey walls, the wedding begins shrinking into memory. The candles, the vows, the muddy streets, the tense negotiations beside the hearth, the suspicious glances over missing silver, the wild dancing beneath smoky rafters. All of it already feels farther away than yesterday. Yet certain images remain strangely vivid. The bride holding rosemary beneath candlelight, rain running down the church windows, lanterns swaying over the forest road, the sound of monastery bells through mist, the dog stealing sausages with criminal dedication. Those small things survive longest in memory, perhaps because they belong less to history and more to ordinary life. You wander slowly through the abbey courtyard while the travellers prepare quietly for departure. Saddlebags are fastened, blankets folded, wheels checked for mud and damage. No one rushes. Morning here unfolds at the patient rhythm. Monasteries teach so well bells, prayer, bread, labour, silence. The grey sky begins brightening little by little above the walls. A novice hangs wet cloaks along a line beside the kitchens. Another carries fresh beeswax candles into the chapel, where dim golden light flickers against ancient stone saints, worn smooth by centuries of hands brushing across them. No one can quite agree whether such places feel holy because of God, memory, or simply because generations of weary travellers have rested safely here. Perhaps holiness is only accumulated relief. The thought lingers with you as the bells ring again. Soon the road calls everyone onward once more. The pilgrims gather their staffs. Merchants count coins carefully beneath their breath. The widow ties her cloak tighter and thanks the monks with tired sincerity. One traveller leaves a small copper piece beside the chapel door in gratitude for shelter. Even the torn-ear dog seems reluctant to leave the warmth of the abbey hearth. Eventually, though, the gates open. Cold morning air spills inward, carrying the scent of wet forests and distant chimney smoke. Beyond the walls, the muddy roads wait patiently beneath pale daylight, stretching toward towns, farms, rivers, and all the uncertain places people continue travelling despite every danger attached to them. You pause once before leaving. Behind you, the abbey bells continue their steady rhythm through the mist. Ahead, the road bends away between dripping trees. And somewhere far behind those woods stands the manor where the wedding feast blazed so brightly against the storm-dark world outside. Perhaps the bride and groom still sleep beneath wool blankets and rosemary charms. Perhaps servants already sweep rushes from the hall, while cooks scrape soot from kettles. Perhaps someone still argues softly about dice or inheritance, or whether ravens truly count as omens. Life continues. That may be the quietest truth hidden inside all medieval stories. Not triumph, not tragedy. Continuation. The road goes on. The bells keep ringing. People keep gathering in candlelit halls to promise themselves to one another despite winter, illness, storms, feuds, mud, thieves, wolves, bad harvests, and all the countless fragile uncertainties surrounding them. And somehow, against remarkable odds, warmth survives long enough for another feast, another fire, another wedding procession crossing wet roads beneath grey skies. The morning air grows colder around you now, though not unpleasantly so. You pull your cloak close and begin walking once more beyond the abbey gate while mist drifts low across the fields beyond the forest. Your boots sink softly into the damp earth. Birds move through bare branches overhead. Far behind you, the bells continue fading slowly into distance. The world feels larger now, calmer, sleepier. The memories of the wedding soften further with every step until they become little more than flickering candlelight somewhere deep inside the rain and smoke of the past. And at last, as the road stretches onward beneath the pale, quiet sky, the medieval world itself begins settling gently into stillness around you. Warm hearths dimming behind shuttered windows, monastery candles burning low, wet cloaks drying beside dying fires, tired travellers sleeping beneath wool blankets while rainwater drips softly from ancient stone. The bells fade. The road quiets. The last watchfires dim beneath the morning mist. And slowly, softly, the long dangerous wedding passes into silence.